Will there be like a time after so people to meet? Yeah, because like my Air Force friend was every night.
Yeah, yeah, I'm doing that.
Okay.
We'll proceed.
I'm serious.
Okay. Oh, dude, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Yes. I should have gotten to a career path where people were like buying me shots and beers and stuff, but alas, UAP has not developed into that type of community yet. I think we're ready to kick off then.
Yeah.
Are you starting it off, or how's it going?
Yeah, so I'll just give like a.
Okay.
Just use this microphone. Hey, so I'll just give a. So thanks for coming, guys. This is a really special event, and it's great to have the community on board. So we have a very special guest, Ryan Graves, who was a fighter pilot in the Navy, and like this is a question I actually had. Maybe the first question, like, were you the one that filmed the gimbal video, or was that?
No, it was. We're flying model F-18s, which means there's a two-seat cockpit, pilot, weapon system officer. So pilot and weapon system officer from my squadron captured that footage directly. It was actually like a really good friend of mine who was in my wedding party. So when he landed, people were like, hey, he caught something really interesting. So I went down to a debrief space and had them watch them debrief the radar data and that video to the admiral and the other intel officers down there.
Cool. So that's kind of how Ryan got started with this business. And let's just start the intro. So Graves Squadron, filmed like the famous gimbal video. So we'll play the video for you guys.
LNS was launching.
Sorry, what was that?
So he said, is that the LNS? So he's asking, is that the active track that the systems are monitoring, essentially, because he's so bizarre. What he's seeing, it doesn't conform to the kinematics that he would expect to see. So he's saying, hey, is that the LNS? Is that the launch and steer cue, right? The primary weapon system's ready to engage. And he's saying, yes, it is. That's what LNS is.
Cool. So glad we didn't fire on them. But
Yeah. They didn't. Well, actually, they might have had live ordnance. We were doing a workup cycle for a deployment, but they would not have pulled the trigger on a random object.
Okay. So we got some safety protocols. So this video was like a major part of the modern sort of UFO transparency and disclosure movement. It was featured in the 2017 New York Times article that kind of started the modern era. And so Ryan has been really like strong advocate for air safety and air transparency and destigmatization of reporting of the stuff, which we'll hear him talk about. If you want like a more detailed like technical stuff about this video, and you can ask him, but there's also like plenty, it's a Q&A, so, but we can also, there's a bunch of interviews of him. He was on Lex Fridman's podcast and Joe Rogan's podcast, for example, like talking for hours, and also testified in front of Congress about this. Maybe I should have started with that. But yeah, so that's the background. And so like just what's going on in Congress. So the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, has sponsored UFO legislation for the last couple of years. And he said some stuff about, like here's a tweet that he's like very powerful UFO transparency advocate, for example. And there's a lot of stuff that's been going on, especially since the 2017 New York Times article. We could spend like days talking about all this stuff, but there's some legislation that was presented in front of Congress. So this like UAP Disclosure Act was the most recent one. It was killed in committee a couple of years in a row, but it was talking about having reporting mechanisms and defined a lot of wild terms like non-human intelligence, legacy crash retrieval programs. And it was killed 2 years in a row, but there have still been transparency efforts, for example, sponsored by Kirsten Gillibrand, and that have passed. And we also have a couple House Oversight Committee hearings. So Ryan was at the landmark hearing. It was the first UFO hearing in over 50 years. And so it was Ryan, Captain Fravor, or Commander Fravor, and David Grush. So some two fighter pilots, Ryan and David Grush was an intelligence officer. So they were talking a lot about different aspects of internal investigations, and also like aerospace, like how do the pilots experience these things in the wild. And there's a long history. It didn't just start in 2017. It really started in 1947, or probably for longer than human history, depending on your perspective. But the modern history is these things have been seen by the military at least since 1947. And yeah, so we have a lot of resources, like over here if you're interested in learning more. And yeah, so this event is run by the Yale Student UFO Society. So if feel free to join us and keep up to date on what we're up to. And with that, I'll let Ryan sort of take the stage.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thank you for the introduction. I just live a couple hours north of here, north of Boston, so I thought it would be fun to come down here. One of the people I used to fly with in the Navy, actually, in F-18s, went to school here. Was reminisced on how he enjoyed it here. Any mathematics majors in here? Oh, that's right, yeah. Is Kleinerman still teaching?
Sounds familiar.
He did a lot of work on black holes, I believe, and event horizons.
Oh, yeah, there's one dude at Princeton that might be the guy.
Oh, maybe I'm thinking of the wrong guy.
He
For some reason I was thinking it was Yale instead of Princeton, but you might be right, it was Princeton. But either way, my friend went here, but a lot of fond memories. I intend this to be informal and conversational if there are questions. So, I'll get into it. And, as I told Sheree, I don't really have a time limit per se. So if the conversation is good, then we can keep going. Not to suggest when I said I have to stop, it means your questions got bad. But so anyways, Andrew up there, who was take some photos of me, asked me how I got into flying. And I think it's probably relevant for this audience, at least partially. My junior year of college, I got a internship. I was doing a dual master's bachelor's program, mechanical and fire protection engineering. And they plopped I drove down to Atlanta from Boston, was there for 2 days. They dropped a book on my desk that was about yay big. It probably weighed 30 pounds. And they're like, these are all the fire regulations in the United States that you're going to have to work with intimately for the next, X years of your career. And that's literally the moment I decided to do something else. I literally, before I even stood up from the desk, I decided this was no longer for me, but I ended up quitting the next day, driving back up to Massachusetts, and trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life after that. I knew I enjoyed the sciences, engineering, the technical aspect, but I wanted to be more hands-on than just, sitting there and abiding by legal regulations that were determined in the 1800s. And I, it was like, how can I expose myself to interesting technology and experiences? And, being part of a team would be pretty cool too, instead of just sitting in an office all day. So ultimately I decided flying jets was the coolest thing I could come up with. Most interesting, most appealing. But it was obviously a long shot. But that's what kind of triggered me in the flying, and I was successful enough. And the Navy had such a need that I was successful in I ultimately, let me backtrack. I changed my major to aerospace engineering, so I could, and I overloaded so I could finish on time, and ultimately applied and was successful in getting in with the Navy. But UAP was not, that wasn't a term I knew of. UFO, it was more of a cultural and movie trope than anything else for me, and something I enjoyed in that context, but not something I thought deeply about. I don't have any personal experience other than what I'll describe here in a little bit. But life went on, and we went into the training pipeline. I'm happy to answer any questions about flying F-18s. It was a very cool career. Certainly something that I was very grateful to be able to even do and succeed in. But what that led me to in late 2012, early 2013 was we had come back from our deployment aboard the USS Enterprise, and we upgraded our radar systems when we came back, entered a maintenance phase. And during that time, it took about 8 months for us to upgrade those radars. We started observing radar contacts in our working areas off the coast of Virginia Beach that we weren't seeing with the older radar systems. And at first we thought they were radar glitches. However, we have multiple sensors on the jet, as you may imagine: electrical, optical, infrared, standard optical, RF, electronic warfare sensors, all sorts of stuff. There's a very capable algorithms that go along with that allow us to do some pretty cool things, such as identifying contacts, not just transponder codes, but what kind of engines are they using? What kind of aircraft is it? And when we see something on a radar, we have a confidence of how good of a track that is. It's not a decoy, or it's not a jamming technique or something like that. But, we were seeing these tracks. They're extremely high confidence, just like any other aircraft we would see out there. But, it couldn't be that there was 5 to 8 objects just zipping around our area. So we assumed they're radar errors until some of these other systems on our jet began to also detect and correlate the position of these objects across multiple different bands and detection modalities. So we had to assume they were solid. They were real objects. And we began to try to visually ID them. We would find one that was close to stationary. We would usually step down about 500 feet or so, slow down about 200 knots, and we would acquire the object with our radar, with our missile systems, with our camera systems, and all that would get pumped into our helmet, into essentially an augmented reality system. So it's essentially, literally drawing a box around where we should be looking for this contact as we come up to this merge. And as that happens, we don't see anything where it should be. We circle back around and we reacquire the target across all our sensors, and it's apparently displaced, it seems, slightly, but still there. But that was, again, kind of the status quo at this point. I'm not sure what that meant or really how to interpret it, other than it was a curiosity and a potential hazard, now that we had to assume that they were physical. But a couple weeks after that, we had our first visual sighting, and it occurred during what was a near midair. At the entrance to our working areas off the coast, 2 aircraft from my squadron were flying out there in close formation, about 150 feet apart. And one of these objects went right by the right wing of the lead aircraft, about 50 feet, which is well within the 500-foot safety bubble that the aviation community uses. So, very near miss, basically as close as you can get. The pilot, air crew, they canceled the flight. They came back and landed. I was in the ready room when they came back, still had their gear on, mouth open. And he's like, I almost hit one of those fucking things. And we all knew who he was talking about, but we didn't have a name for it really at this point, because it had just kind of been talked about unofficially, not a part of the brief or anything like that, but just kind of in the chatter. But at that point, the squadron safety officer had to step in. An official hazard report had to be filed on that near miss. And that began an investigation into how prevalent this issue had been. And oh, by the way, he described this object to us for the first time and just simply described it as a dark gray or a black cube inside of a clear sphere. Essentially the point or the apex of the cube touching the inside of that sphere, best you could tell. Estimated to be about 5 to 15 feet in diameter. And these objects that we were seeing, we would be seeing them completely stationary, which doesn't sound super impressive, but almost like being in the ocean. There's always a tide, there's always a current. In this case, air currents could be 100, 120 knots. So to have something that's precisely stationary in the sky when, even an F-18 is getting blown out of the area is quite impressive. We'd see them 0.4 to 0.6 Mach, about 250 to 350 knots. We'd see them in circular patterns, racetrack patterns. We'd see them flying inconsistent headings and inconsistent altitudes, but generally trending in a general quadrant. And we'd see them supersonic, 1.1 to 1.2 as Mach as well. So to see, finally have some realization of what these look like and to have them described like that and understand that these were the things that were potentially, representing all these different kinematic envelopes, didn't answer any questions for us, fortunately. But as the safety officer did his investigation, it turned out that there were 4 other near mid-airs just in our squadron over the past month and a half that went unreported due to just general uncertainty and stigma about what was going on out there. And that's kind of when we realized, as a squadron that we had a problem. So, we all kind of debriefed the commanding officer with the expectation it would get briefed upwards. We filed the safety reports. We weren't expecting anything back from that, more of a data repository. And we went about our business and we said, okay, well, we're not going to fly near them. I mean, if, that's, our mission is not to investigate weird things in the sky. It costs $30,000 per hour to fly one of these machines. So we go out, we have to do our training. We just avoid them. And so that's what we did. We continued to see them for the next year and a half or so. Never got any resolution, and then began a workup cycle where we operated off the USS Theodore Roosevelt off the coast of Jacksonville, Florida. And when we got down there, the objects were still there, they were already there, or they followed us down. And during the exercise, unbeknownst to me at the time, there were dozens of incidents with the aircraft and the off the carrier. I wasn't aware of all that, but I learned it after the fact. I was aware, however, of an incident that occurred with a single aircraft from my squadron with 2 close friends of mine who had returned from a large air-to-air training mission. And when it's a little complicated, but generally speaking, you have to wait to land, and you basically stop fighting once you reach a certain fuel number, and then you essentially come back on the throttle, and you maintain a max endurance flight profile. So slow, not pulling any G, so you can preserve your fuel and wait for the deck to open up. So they had knocked off the fight. They went their max endurance profile, and they kind of just were buzzing towards the carrier when they start detecting all these objects east of the carrier. And so they generally point in that direction. Again, traveling slowly, so they had, it took them like 6 or 7 minutes to approach these objects. They were about 50 miles away. And, there was about 12 objects. The first group was a group at about 15,000 feet. A single object from that was captured on the FLIR. And that video is known as the Go Fast video now. Not well named. The pilots never made the assumption it was going fast. They just didn't know what it was and why it was flying in a line abreast formation with 4 other objects 350 miles out to sea. On the eastern side of the carrier too, right? So now, if this was some kind of air penetration test or some kind of, aircraft operation, this thing has to fly 350 miles and then fly around the 50-mile control zone of the carrier to end up on the back side. Now to go back, you're talking 1,000-mile round trip, right? Fuel planning. It's not where you'd expect, normal traffic to be. As they passed that group of objects, they approached another group of objects. Again, a single one that they captured on the FLIR system. This one's typically referred to as the the GIMBAL video. And we saw it up there a moment ago. Behind that object was a formation of about 4 to 6 other objects that were seemingly smaller, more reminiscent of what we were traditionally used to seeing in Virginia Beach and elsewhere, but the GIMBAL object was larger and more distinct than what we had seen before. The formation of objects were in a wedge formation, and they were proceeding essentially in this direction. They turned, they all jumbled up, they weren't executing like a formation flying mechanics as they turned. and then they reformed in the wedge and proceeded 180 degrees out. The gimbal object, which was essentially following that, it paused for a second and then instantaneously reversed direction and followed the formation. Through later analysis, I've understood that the instantaneous change in direction actually represented a vertical U-turn, because my frame of reference was from a God's eye view radar display. So I don't get to see that vertical change in altitude. It just appears as kind of a pause and a bounce, right? So whatever this was conducting a very tight vertical U-turn in about 200 feet of airspace, which, you know, an F-18 takes about a minimum at 5,000 feet, 3,500 feet to do a vertical turn, right? That's important when you're dogfighting, so you don't slam into the deck, no things like that. And that just gets worse as you get higher, right? So at these altitudes, at 20,000 feet where this happened, you know, be expecting 5,000, 6,000 feet for that turn. But obviously this thing was going much slower. But also, it's also a very fuel inefficient maneuver. It's the most fuel inefficient maneuver you could do in order to change your direction. So with that in mind too, let's not forget how far out this object is. So are these dispensable? You know, is it going somewhere else? How to get out there? I mean, it opens up a lot of questions. So that was the state of play. The crew eventually had to point back to the aircraft carrier to get ready to land. And when they came back, I watched them debrief not only the tapes that you saw, but the situational awareness page. And you hear them reference it in there when they say on the SA, right? And so that's that God's eye view radar data that is their primary sensor out there. So that's a little context about those videos. We all went back. We're basically just told to shut up about it, and we went about our day. And I didn't realize that this was one of dozens of incidents that had occurred during this training evolution. And years later, I learned that the admiral who I watched these videos, he apparently went back, I learned, and emailed the major commands along the eastern seaboard to basically say, whose is this? What's going on? We're getting close to the point of actually canceling our training missions out here, which again is a big evolution. If this doesn't succeed, the aircraft carrier in the Middle East does not get replaced in a month and a half, 2 months, right? So it's a big deal. And they were getting close, right? They didn't know what to do. So we went about our business, isolated and not knowing the bigger picture, and eventually left on our deployment. I left the squadron while we were on deployment because it was my time to rotate, and I went to Meridian, Mississippi and became a flight instructor in the Navy. And didn't think about this really anymore, to be honest, until 2017 when they released 2 of those videos in New York Times. And, you know, as I'm sitting in my flight suit on the couch and going, holy shit, like these are my buddies' voices I'm hearing. And that's when I had the realization that like what we had thought was going to happen, that this potential, intelligence gap, this potential adversarial action, whatever this was not getting the proper treatment it deserved, and that this article is essentially a cry for help. So I reached out to some of my colleagues on the East Coast that were flying, West Coast, elsewhere. Are you still having issues? Yes, they're still having these issues. They basically had just posted a general notice to be cautious. That was really the best they could do, and they were briefing to it. And then I spoke to some of the other instructor pilots the next day in the ready room who had come from the East Coast and elsewhere, like myself, and asked them if they remember the stuff that we were seeing out there. And about half the room basically raised their hand and said, yeah, the cubes and spheres, right? It's like, okay, as if it was normal. Because we never really pulled each other, when I was out on the East Coast. It was something that we were trying to just move away from so we could do our main job and, not embarrass ourselves out there as the new guys in the fleet. It's very much a reputation-based business. So, it turned out, it was pretty common. It wasn't just us. Anyone that had a sufficiently powerful enough radar was having the same type of issues. And that's when I chose to speak out about it. I thought that perhaps by providing some context around the incidents that were talked about in that article, that it might elevate the seriousness of the issue to be able to allow whomever needed to do so within the Pentagon to actually try to resolve this in a manner that would, prevent in midair with one of my colleagues. This was personal to me. It wasn't just, it wasn't just conceptual. I mean, these were people that were actively dealing with this, and I had the ability to help in some small way, and so that's what I elected to do. So I spoke to the Senate Armed Service Committee, and through invitation after a process, but I was guided to them. I shared my story, others did too. And that began this process of the Senate Armed Service Committee looking into this topic that has led to, at least played a part, I will say, in a lot of the momentum that we've seen in Congress on this topic over the past 5 years or so. And it wasn't just simply us or our group of pilots, but people started reaching out to me as the story started to expand from there. I participated in a New York Times article, was on Joe Rogan, 60 Minutes. And people started reaching out to me to share their experiences. Some were pretty crazy, I'll admit. But others were very serious, credible, respected, well-trained, in some cases, professional observers who were seeing some pretty amazing things and really didn't know what to do with that information. And had seen that I had gone through this process and respected my background as an aviator, and started emailing me. Before you know it, we had hundreds of reports, and I mean, the quality of the people can't be understated. I mean, these are, in some cases, extremely successful people, financially, within their, individual careers. Astronauts have reached out to me, investment bankers, average people, and, we have over 800 reports now. And we formalize this into a nonprofit work that I do at Americans for Safe Aerospace, where we work closely with members of Congress in the House and the Senate to advise and guide them on legislation that will improve the issue that we've discovered through this data. And the issue is the fact that this is basically an everyday occurrence. It's not restricted to military training zones. It's not restricted to nuclear facilities. It's not restricted to the United States. And the very pilots that you get on the plane and see in the 737 at the airport are contacting me near daily to tell me about very hard to rationalize experiences. And some of these experiences have caused these professionals to go home and drug test themselves the next day. They don't know what to do with this information, and they're optimistic that the organization we put together has the connections and resources to be able to maybe not resolve the case for them, maybe not even help them better understand it, but at least give them the comfort to know that that information is being acted upon in the best way that it can be. And we do that through collaboration with the scientific group as well as with federal law enforcement. We work with the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, which a group of which I also chair, where we've put together a group of hardware specialists in sensing, detection, characterization, and evaluation is the mantra we use. As well as human factors, where it's more about the process of interacting with these from an aviation safety perspective. So how are these being reported? How are pilots reacting to them? Are the existing reporting infrastructures sufficient to be able to support pilots in submitting this information? And so we work with a group of specialists in that area that evaluate some of the reports that my nonprofit has essentially lent them to do that. And we work with the FBI as well. We've helped collaborate a bottoms-up approach there, where there's now an active group at a national level that is not only investigating the cases that we bring them for national security implications, but also a much wider spectrum of issues related to this that involve classified programs and things of that nature. So it's been very fruitful. I've also as I just mentioned, work on the technical side in this field through the work at the AIAA. I helped found and now chair the UAP Integration and Outreach Committee, which is a formal committee at the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. And we hold paper sessions once a year at the Ascend and Aviation Conference. We hold panel sessions And we work throughout the year on various detection, characterization, and evaluation projects that we have going on, from optical sensing, passive radar systems, hyperspectral sensing systems, radar analytics, sidecar projects where we attach computational resources to the side of military equipment in order to intercept raw radar data for analysis. So there's some interesting work and ideas going on there, if anyone would like to collaborate with us. So I realize I just kind of just blabbered for a while, and there's a lot of different areas we can go from here, but that just provides some context about, who I am and how I got involved in this. And, Andrew also mentioned up there that he was doing a project on belief. So he made me stand in front of some equations that ultimately may be incorrect. But, for me, this has never been a conversation or a ideological journey around belief. It's been about my observations, interactions with, what we've experienced, and looking for the data that's going to allow us to understand this further. I don't know where we go from acknowledging that there are unidentified objects in our airspace that appear to exhibit capabilities beyond the state of the art. I think the United States government has essentially said that in so many words, through pending legislation, through activity within the DoD, within activity at NASA, the Senate, the House. But where do we go from there, right? Everyone wants to jump to a conclusion about the origin of what that unknown is. And that's where I would urge caution. And that's the ledge that I stand on and try to engage on with my work at both ASA and the AIAA. It's about being able to generate data, whether it be soft data through witness collection that perhaps can provide, more hard and repeatable data based on if we have a large enough data set. It's about using technical data collection means to validate or invalidate perhaps some of those visual sightings, or to provide different signatures for further detection systems. And a lot of how I've seen this topic change since I first got engaged as, a very tactical issue, right? We're trained as fighter pilots, and we have $1 million worth of tools at our disposal to tell who is who in the sky and to potentially shoot one down if we need to. So for us, the reality of having unidentified objects that are operating with impunity within our airspace is a massive red flag for us. It's counter to everything that we do within that profession. And good national security and just common sense would dictate that we would want to know what those are, especially if they're operating in a repeatable fashion. We would want to study that, understand it, and hope that it's not an adversary, but be curious if we have determined that it is not an adversary. So, we've seen that kind of narrative develop a little bit since the hearing that I participated in. There have been, various upcroppings of UAP activity that have occurred since then, and one particular incident has been what appears to be a repeatable string of sightings that started in 2022 at Langley Air Force Base. And Langley Air Force Base is almost like a sister base to the base I was operating out of. Instead of F-18s, they have F-22s. They're about 100 miles from D.C., and they actually provide quick response, fighter response to D.C. should there be any type of threat. And it's about 80 miles north of the airspace that we were operating in when we had our incidents. And starting in 2022, they had a number of incursions of unknown objects over the base at very low altitude that were about car-sized. They hovered over the base doing altitude changes of about 1,000 feet before departing back over the ocean. It was about 5 of them. It lasted for about 2 hours. And it lasted for about a handful of days. 2023, during the same kind of period of time, right before Christmas, the same thing happened again. This time there were 2 kind of forms of objects. One that appeared to be more spherical, another one that was more flattened, if you will, or disc-shaped. The spherical objects came up the bay again, executed a flight at about 3,000 feet. The individual objects were separated by about half a mile or a mile. There's photos of all this. And they proceeded up the bay, stopped at Langley Air Force Base for about an hour and a half, conducted some type of operation, and then proceeded in that counterclockwise back over the water and exited. The second group, which operated at about treetop level, as it was described, went in a clockwise fashion. Instead of stopping at the base, they stopped at the nuclear facility that was on the west side of the bay for about the same amount of time before departing. There was a local eyewitness who contacted us. We ended up, routing that witness to the FBI. And actually, recently, he was on 60 Minutes last weekend talking about the New Jersey drone incidents. Butner. So that was 2023. 2024 comes around. Law enforcement is ready. They have systems set up at the base in order to see what happens this time. And again, during the exact same period of time, about 5 weeks before Christmas, we have a major outcropping of sightings. But this time, not just over Langley. It seemed to be much more prevalent further north into New Jersey, but also at military bases around the country. There were base shutdowns in Ohio, in Texas, in California, in Massachusetts, in New York, New Jersey, of course, Pennsylvania. I believe there's one in Florida. And ultimately, I believe it was Air Force recently, about a month ago, testified that there were 350, what they're labeling as drones, but of unknown type, unknown mission, and unknown operator that operated over military bases in 2024 alone. And that says nothing about the reports that were cited over civilian airspace and things of that nature. So, it was a bit theoretical trying to explain the concept of having, existing in a world where there's a lot of small form factor vehicles, and how are we going to understand what's a threat, what's not, and what's something else perhaps. That was the argument I was making back in, 2018, and these incidents of New Jersey, I think, really pointed to the fact that, exemplified for people just how disturbing and how problematic it can be if there are a lot of unidentified objects operating in our airspace. What we did run into in that incident was a lot of legislative and policy restrictions that allowed for the further investigation of that. There were companies, counter unmanned aerial system companies, that had very sophisticated detection systems that could have been employed on the ground, but no one within the federal government could figure out whose authority it was to give them permission. Airspace was federal, but it was, they're operating off of local land. Are they using active systems? State and local law enforcement didn't feel like they had the jurisdiction. So it was a real mess. And they're still interested in getting out there, and we're actually collaborating with them to get out there, hopefully in the next month, to see if we can utilize those systems. But it has died down significantly. And of course, the aviation safety piece is critical outside of national security. I mean, we were nearly hitting these objects. We have regular sightings over LaGuardia, near New York, going back almost 5 years at this point, very consistent. Some very near aircraft between 2,000 and 8,000 feet. There's other areas as well. Portland Airport has consistent sightings around it, as well as others. So, I mean, it's not always about thinking that one of these are going to hit a pilot, whatever they are, or hit an aircraft, something like that. It's about how the pilot reacts to what they are seeing when they're not expecting something to be there. And in the gray space where there's uncertainty, there's still a lot of risk of a safety incident occurring. But when there's, a very powerful experience where a guy is seeing something within 500 feet of his 737 that, he's never seen in his life or imagined he would, that's a different type of risk that's now in that cockpit that, needs to be addressed through educating pilots that, this is a common occurrence, as it seems now. So I'm going to just stop. I'm going to shut up now. I've been talking for like 30 minutes. And maybe we can, maybe we can ping the room with a little bit of question, and then, I'm sure those will delve us into different areas. So maybe it's a good time to do that. Does anyone have a burning question right now? Go ahead.
I was just thinking about like the gimbal video, like the hue around the object.
Yeah.
What would you guys would that consider?
So the gimbal is one thing that's important to remember when watching the gimbal or the Go Fast video. You see the black and white video. That is an infrared camera system, right? So it's in an infrared mode. And so what you're seeing is a temperature differential between the pixels. And so in that video, the object is kind of dish-shaped and almost pointy, in the middle on each end. I can't say with uncertainty that corresponds to the physical, makeup of the object, right? That could be the IR energy that's being emanated across, the skin of the vehicle in such a manner that makes it hard for my sensor to see. Now that would be beyond the signal management capabilities of modern systems to be able to mask your IR signature to that degree and disperse that energy in that manner. I will say that. And that's something we're very keen on as fighter pilots. It's a very important concept for us. Signal management in general, right? So that would be a very significant capability. So I'll have to say, the aura around it, it's most likely blooming from the camera or something like that, but it's really hard to say because we're just seeing temperature gradient, right, and what that corresponds to.
But being that it's like lighter, is it like, would you say the differential is like positive or negative, or?
It depends on when the video you watch it, because I think they switch between white hot and black hot mode, or maybe I'm misremembering, but we often switch between that so that white is the whiter it is, the hotter it is. But if something, I don't interpret that signal as it truly having like a physical aura around it. There could be a temperature differential that's around it because of the way the air is moving or something like that, but I don't know. Yeah.
What do you see as the biggest challenge or source of friction that is this source of stigma around UAP research? Like, what's the main thing that we're trying to overcome to make this research be taken more seriously?
Yeah, there's a couple of aspects. There's the social stigma, of course, and some of that is induced with, I think, our fascination of this topic, right, culturally, and, we see it in our media, and whenever you see something in a movie, you're like, okay, well, that's make-believe, that's pretend, that's fantasy. And so for people to then grasp on to something that people believe is a fantasy and investigate it, it could cause you to lower your social standing, perhaps, right? And I know that, sounds like a poor excuse for not engaging on this, but, it's a very powerful effect, especially over decades of people treating this topic a certain way. But the reality is that, we live in a different world now, and the types of threats that we face as a country require us to do the same things, right? To understand these objects in a way that allow us to understand whether they are a threat or whether there's something else, right? And then if we do determine there's something else, then, we shouldn't throw that away. And so that, there's a lot of cultural stigma, and I see that a lot with pilots, especially pilot communities. And, I mentioned aviation is a very reputational-based industry. I mean, it's no joke. I mean, your personality, the way you deal and respond to issues, how you prioritize things, those are the things that will most likely get you kicked out of flight school, right? And so when you're in the fleet, it's flight school on steroids. That's your career. People have been dreaming about that their whole life. And so, you get to ride an $8 million jet once or twice a day. It's pretty cool. So who wants to stick their head up and say, hey, I'm going to go totally off the reservation and start, putting a lot of energy into this. And it's a zero-sum game. If you're putting energy into that, you're not putting it into reading Top Gun manual, right? So it's something that tepidly people just don't want to engage. And on the commercial side, same thing. I mean, when I started this conversation, pilots would see something in the cockpit and not share it with their co-pilot. Then they would share it with their co-pilot, then it would go over the radio. Now they're finally radioing ATC about it because and that's a big step because now their name, their company is tied, in a publicly searchable manner to that incident, that reporting. And pilots have received cease and desist letters. It was actually illegal for a period of time for commercial pilots to report UFOs back in the 70s, $10,000 fine, or I think it was like 5 years in jail, because they were afraid of it essentially clogging up lines for communication for threats with the Soviets. So, there's all that kind of adds on to it. And then there's an institutional stigma and a prioritization as well. And I'm going to completely ignore the fact that there could already be like an operational program that is doing stuff. And I'll answer that in a second. But there's no way that, our advantage in the world, one of the greatest advantages that we have as a country, is the fact that, we're an open market that, bubbles up innovation when we, discover problems around us and come up with solutions to solve them. Other countries around the world, in some cases, take a more direct route where they allocate resources towards a strategic vision that's long-term, and they invest in order to make that vision a reality. And they hope the world doesn't change and that they made the right predictions and they don't waste all that money. And sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. Sometimes we respond slowly to problems because we have to generate new solutions. We didn't plan ahead. But ultimately, the amount of innovation and cool products that we come up with are pretty much 100% unparalleled across the world. So when you think about the UAP issue, this institutional bias against, studying this and resolving it, there's no resources that the government allocates towards harnessing that innovation ecosystem that makes us so powerful and so innovative. And we see organizations across the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, NASA, the Defense Innovation Unit, all designed to harness startups and ideas and take them to solve problems, except in this space, right? So there's no mechanisms to go to the National Science Foundation and say, here's an advanced sensor system that uses hyperspectral and fuses data with a passive radar system to, find tracks that otherwise we wouldn't see. Or here's a mechanism to do an analysis of next rad weather data across the United States that we'd like to run on a system. None of that exists. And so we need to be able to kind of open up those pipelines within government to allow this to be a topic of interest within Department of Defense funding lines, within NASA, within National Science Foundation, and actually leverage that ecosystem that allows us to bring such cool things, to bear in warfare and market and everywhere else. So turning on the funding in the government, getting that buy-in, and reducing the social stigma so that more people come out. I talk to groups I work a lot with the National Science Foundation, and they're actually very interested in this topic. I could talk about that in a minute, but I'm briefing a room of 100, 120 of their funded entrepreneurs and CEOs, and having a conversation. And it turns out about half of the room would raise their hand and say that they have their own personal experiences, with the UAP. So I think we'll find is that the social stigma is lowered, the amount of reports will increase, the amount we learn about perhaps just how common people have these types of experiences. It's going to really, I think, allow us to kind of shape a solution to better understanding it. So, yeah.
And just to follow up, do you think that the prevalence of reporting can actually lead to an increase in false reports from a sort of, people trying to jump on a bandwagon, if you would? And how do we navigate that area?
Yeah, that's an easy problem. I mean, there's always going to be false or poor reports, or reports that just have such little data that they're not useful, right? And the idea is you have a large enough data pool, it's very easy to filter out and just get the creme de creme, using machine learning, things of that nature, just standard algorithms.
Yeah, hi. I kind of want to go back to some of the stuff you were talking about with the sightings over at Langley. You said a lot of the objects were flying through the Chesapeake Bay. And I assume a lot of the, aircraft are flying what seems like from the horizon just off Virginia Beach. And it seems like a lot of the sightings are happening in the Whiskey 50 zones out there. I'm wondering, you must have a lot of people come forward from the submarine community. I'm wondering if it's plausible to assume that these things might be operating underwater, and what, some of your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, that's a common thought about whether they're operating from the water, both in the New Jersey instance as well as Langley instance. A lot of these objects originated from over the water. For us, when we're flying in the jet, it's very hard for us to discern whether something goes into the water. we'll just lose radar contact as it gets close to it. So from that perspective, I don't have an answer. I have many, many reports of these objects going into or out of the water. But yeah, I think that's really all I can say on it. It appears so, but I have no direct evidence that that's the case. Was that the extent of your question, or did I miss a piece of it?
I guess I'm wondering, has it been ruled out completely that these things might be launching from like a Chinese surveillance ship outside territorial waters?
Yeah. So there's actually not that many reports from sub guys. They're extremely tight-lipped, and there's only a certain category of them that have access to view the different types of data on the sub that would be of interest, right? So you need someone like a command position or something like that, or a sensor operator. But there are certainly reports. Sorry, what was the second part of the question, or the part I missed? Say it again. I'm sorry, guys.
I guess for a long time, I'm a prior Navy guy, like there was a lot of speculation as to whether or not these objects were launching from a lot of these surveillance ships just outside territorial waters. I'm wondering if that's been ruled out by now.
So it's a good question. That's why I wanted to ping on it. So there's a few options for that, right? Some people were suggesting that the New Jersey drones were launched by a criminal gang, right? Perhaps acting as in way of another country so that there wasn't direct political ramifications. Another option was there was an Iranian drone ship that satellites I'd seen had left port, and then about a week later, we're having these incidents, but it turned out it was like 100 miles away from Iran, and that wasn't the case. So I work in, well, I'm not focused on this. I also consult with Office of Naval Research. I also worked in defense industry, BAE Systems, working with DARPA and Air Force Research Lab, Strategic Capabilities Office, on advanced autonomy and weapon systems. The idea of a Connex box with cool capabilities on it, whether it's painted in camo or not, is certainly something I think a lot of countries, track and are aware of. But we have very sophisticated capabilities to monitor civilian shipping traffic off our coast, and same for submarines as well. It's such a huge part of our nuclear trident capability as well as other countries. And so, I'm highly confident that the government has the ability to track those standard capabilities that would launch those types of things. And when they say they haven't detected those in the public statements about New Jersey, I tend to believe them on that part of it. I don't have any direct evidence that there weren't any ships like that involved, and that's certainly what I was thinking about as well. But they would have to be, if they're launched from a submarine, they wouldn't be recoverable, and then you have a space limitation. These objects are the size of an SUV, right? So how many are coming off a sub? Cargo container would be, something that could support a mission like that, perhaps, but it'd be very easy to track and determine.
Now, is this something that you think would be accurately tracked if coming through the atmosphere? Like, do you think U.S. Space Command actually has the resources to track everything that's coming through? You said like you have full confidence in what's being launched from territorial waters. I'm wondering, on the opposite hand, anything coming from the atmosphere, would that be something that'd be tracked?
Yeah, I have a higher confidence in atmospheric tracking because a significant portion of our surface-to-air and missile defense system is designed to track intercontinental ballistic missiles. So objects that extend into space and then re-enter and strike targets. That's like massive. Like that's where most of our investment has gone into. So I would have high confidence then being able to track off, especially if they're IR significant and infrared energy significant targets. Yeah, absolutely. But how do you trick that, right? Right. So you trick it by going faster. Then they have a harder time to respond and recalculate for missile intercepts through hypersonic missiles, and that's why you see so much investment in that area. And oh, by the way, they can fly low. And on the other end is you can fly slow, right? And those radar systems, detection systems, or you can be really small, aren't designed to track objects like that necessarily. So if you had a capability to, essentially insert aerial vehicles from a low Earth orbit platform potentially, that would be the only kind of conceivable, man-made technology that would be able to insert, aerial vehicles, from orbit. And, it's a very rich area. I do a lot of work in space as well. there are some pretty cool stuff going on there, but not to the operational scope that we saw in New Jersey and elsewhere.
Thank you. With sightings increasing here and elsewhere, what kind of international collaboration is happening, if at all?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's been some attempts, collaboration. I've done some briefings to NATO leadership in Europe. There was an effort to stand up a working group at the UN that I was involved with, but one of the sponsoring companies had a coup, as happened, so that resolution was taken off the UN's desk. Still waiting for another opportunity. I forget the name of the country, but San Marino? Yeah, it was San Marino. Yeah. There's a lot of interest in different countries and involvement, from China and Russia to Brazil and Australia and elsewhere. And my nonprofit, Americans for Safe Aerospace, has a strategy right now to engage some of those interested groups in some of those other countries and essentially set up, Australians for Safe Aerospace, or Japan for Safe Aerospace, and lend them our reporting system, so that they can essentially stand up their own organization within their host country, but also to funnel that data back to us so that we have a broader understanding of the reports globally.
And one more question, please. What evidence, if any, do we have of non-human intelligence?
Well, that's a great question, and that's what I mentioned before. I'm not at a point where I can make a statement that says, here's why I think it's anything beyond an unknown craft making, exhibiting capability beyond state of the art. I would argue, yes, that is reflection of intelligence if it truly is a technology that's beyond our state of the art. What does that mean, right? Is that an intelligence from somewhere else? Is that a biological intelligence? Is that an algorithm that was beamed over here, like a large language model, right, that we were interacting with? Is it something more exotic that bends space and time and in ways that we don't understand? Do we not have a scientific framework for whatever scientific paradigm they're taking advantage of? Or is it just clever engineering within general relativity that we could perhaps harness without new scientific understanding? Yeah. Oh, that answers your question.
I say, going back to the drone discussion briefly. So I don't remember where I read it, but retired Air Force General Mark Kelly apparently was part of a threat assessment of the drone usage in Ukraine, about whether the United States would be prepared if a foreign adversary used that technology against us. And the result of that assessment is we would not be able to catch up within a year. So taking that into account, what we've been seeing over Langley and then later over New Jersey, could it possibly, is there any credibility to the notion that this could be a red teaming exercise on the part of the United States to kind of expose gaps in our capabilities to detect and deal with drone threats?
Yeah, that wouldn't be wise from a red teaming perspective, considering the international attention. That would be my perspective, is that we are very sensitive about revealing our capabilities or our gaps. I mean, that is why we classify stuff, right? To ensure the enemy doesn't know our capabilities and our gaps and capabilities. Those are the two things. So to publicly demonstrate in an international fashion exactly where our gaps is would be counter to how that would be executed, in my opinion.
Yeah, so I'll actually have a question.
No, actually, let me extend one more thing. So, and that same argument applies for people who question whether perhaps what we saw off the eastern seaboard or elsewhere is just classified weapons testing or something of that nature, or seeing whether our own systems could detect some new capability or something of that nature. It's wrong for a lot of different reasons. We have ranges for that. The F-18 is classified at all security clearance levels, so we've got to utilize certain tools and participate in operating under such security guidelines that come with extremely classified equipment. And when you operate with that type of equipment, you sign non-disclosure agreements, things of that nature, as you might imagine. And if I was to hand someone a binder, on how that weapon system works, you would be in a load of shit, right? As would I. Even you would too, even though you're just a random person, right? You would have to sign NDA. You would have to get formally debriefed by intelligence people. You would have to learn how to talk about it or not talk about it. It'd be a big deal, and we would both be in a lot of shit, and I would be in the most shit. Probably end up going to jail. Now, if I just if I pulled a curtain back and showed you the next generation fighter jet, it'd be the same thing. And it's the same thing if you fly a next generation aircraft or weapon system, even in front of people with the top secret clearance. If I'm not read into the program, it's just as illegal as handing it to someone on the street. So they would be acting illegally by even testing that equipment and exposing it to us. It would require extensive formal debriefs and potentially even legal action. There's a lot of other reasons why it doesn't make sense that they would test that against us, but that's the legal justification about why they wouldn't.
Yeah, so there's presumably like a lot of radar data on this stuff that's somewhere in some military servers. What kind of difficulties, either legally or technically, is there to accessing that information and analyzing that?
I think the biggest hurdle is technical, and I think it's not in the way that you would expect. I don't know how many terabytes or exabytes of data the U.S. military generates per hour or day, right? So they can't preserve all that data. So your assumption about there being a big warehouse of stored radar data is likely incorrect. Even within our jets, people often ask, why don't they release the radar data or anything else? Our card in our jet stores the classified information. We plug it in, plug it out at the end of the day. We can upload the videos and things of that nature. And then we wipe the card, and then the next person uses it. So there's no server within our squadron that it's getting uploaded to. And if it's not specifically saved by one interested individual, then it's trash. And it's funny, when I went to the Senate Armed Services Committee for the very first time back in 2018, they're like, well, where is all this information? Like, you're telling us you guys are seeing this stuff all the time. There's got to be something out there we can look at. And I was like, you can just go to Virginia Beach, walk into the hangars, walk in the ready room, and just ask the duty guys, like, where's your secure space? And just ask a senior lieutenant or someone, just like, where's your folder full of cool shit? Because I guarantee you every squadron has at least a few of them. And it was funny because they actually did do that. I got a call from my friends. They're like, I don't know why people are, in our squadron space going through our servers and whatnot. So, but yeah, they don't preserve it. The idea is that they were going to do a UAP task force, and they built up a personal connection to allow that to happen. And then when AARO came in, they severed all work that was done within the UAP task force, ruined all the connections and goodwill that had occurred, and basically kind of took this our way or the highway mentality with anyone who's going to collaborate. And they don't, to my understanding, they don't collect that data anymore, specifically from pilots. There is an official reporting system, but it's not encouraged really. People don't know it exists. It hasn't really been formally briefed. So that's one of the biggest problems right now, is that the information isn't getting properly accounted for into AARO. And one of the reasons why I've been working with the FBI, because they are actually investing the time and resources to do that work, and they have a bunch of classified military cam footage and whatnot. That's quite interesting.
So if you have any questions, raise your hand. We're going to sort of cycle back,
Yeah, I have 3 questions. So the first question is, do we have any sort of association between the prevalence of where we see these phenomenon and certain different things? Like, are they more associated in higher population areas or certain weather phenomenon? That's the first question. The second question is, if we're only seeing these in infrared, how are civilians really seeing these? Like, I understand pilots on 737 seeing these, but are they only viewable via IR? And then my third question is, you sort of said it wouldn't really be feasible if they're entering or exiting from the atmosphere or the ocean to recover. So have we or to go back to that source, have we been able to recover any of these and sort of run tests on them?
Yeah, I'm going to ask you to repeat some of those questions.
Yeah,
I apologize.
of course,
I have a 2-month-old at my house, so.
Of course, yeah.
this
So the
was a
first
bad
question was about the prevalence of the sightings and certain phenomena like weather phenomena.
Our data set isn't large enough for us to draw any conclusions on that internally for the most part, right? Because there's so many different variables that we really need a substantial data set to really say with any statistical significance. But anecdotally, there very much seems to be centered around military activities, whether it be training ranges or bases themselves. It seems to be a historical correlation and modern with connections related to nuclear facilities. A lot of reports we have, some fascinating stuff apparently has gone on at some of these military bases that kind of, it sounds like you're hearing stories from a haunted house, to be honest. It's quite crazy. These are people that train every day to protect like actual nuclear weapons. Like they don't mess around, and they're actively responding with weapons to like issues on bases. There's certainly some anecdotal evidence. We're not at a point internally where we can make those assessments other than maybe around different groupings of characteristics of the objects themselves. But as far as where they're occurring, it seems to be anywhere from low Earth orbit to, ground altitude and all around the globe. It's hard to say also because, you get a prevalence of reports from, areas where there's military activity. Is there increased activity of those objects, or is it because we have all these sensors there? And again, we don't have enough data to say whether there's, a location bias or sensor bias there. But, certainly global, certainly at all altitudes from surface to above. Sorry, second one?
Yeah, the second question was, infrared.
Oh,
if they're only able to be seen via infrared, how are we talking about civilian reporting in the 737?
We had that one instance where we were having the issue of not seeing them, but people were also seeing them at the same time too. So it was very sporadic. I don't know how to interpret that. Over time, a lot of cases, people very clearly can see them visually. Some cases, like New Jersey drone, I spoke to the head pilot for the special task force that secures airspace over DC, who personally responded to some of the New Jersey drones, and he was very clear. It's like, I can't. Actually, he responded to the 2023 Langley drones. He said we were not able to pick them up on our infrared. I could visually see the light. I could, but our infrared system would not detect it. So it's a mixed bag. Same for radar. The New Jersey drones. The team that I work with in the FBI is part of their weapons of mass destruction directorate. Right? These guys do some pretty cool stuff. They would have, this is also why I was confident saying New Jersey situation wasn't nuclear weapons, because these are the guys that would have directly been responding to those incidents. But they told me directly, the radar is not working to detect these objects. We're not able to detect radio transmissions coming from them to be able to track them or determine, where they're going or to intercept them. They do seem to be exhibiting signal management capabilities, and I think for the most part you probably can visually see them. I can't explain what issue we were having at that early part in our story. Yeah.
And the last question is, have we ever been able to recover?
Yeah, that opens up a can of worms, right? As far as questions. So the New Jersey situation, there's been some rumors about some of them being down and recovered. I haven't seen any additional evidence or follow-up on that. Broadly speaking, right, on this entire topic, I think that question was also addressed, right? Was that related to the entire UAP topic or specific to the New Jersey drone? Sure, I knew you were going to say that. No. All right. So, if we make the assumption that there is a real phenomenon out there, the question is, has one been captured or otherwise been acquired by a government or perhaps a civilian? And that gets into this whole conversation of disclosure. And I think this is an important concept to understand. And I think people typically interpret it as, the government telling you what it already knows about this phenomenon. And of course, that will never work, right? Because people either assume they're lying or disbelieve it, not getting the full truth, which they won't get the full truth, presumably, because something will be classified, right? There's another conversation, however, that's happening now that I think is part of this kind of discovery side of it, if you will, where what can be done in the public sphere through commercial technology, through folks like yourself, to understand this. And in 2025, I think we do have enough over the shelf tools to be able to set up significant detection and tracking capabilities and better understand this without waiting for the government to tell us what they might already know from technology they've been using for longer. And I think these two forces, discovery and disclosure, they build on each other. The more the government acknowledges this, the more it motivates the public sector, and the more the public sector engages on this, the more it pressures the government to discuss it. And I think we're going to continue to see that happen. And traditionally, it's been seen that the government may have acquired some of these objects, and there's a whole line of reasoning around what they have done with those objects as far as legal programs and reverse engineering and all that. I don't have any personal experience, I will say. I've never been read into any of those programs. I was just a pilot. Through my work, I would say, butted up against portions of those efforts. So I'm feeling parts of the elephant, right? But I don't have the full picture. And recently there's been a new person that came forward claiming to have worked on some of these programs. His name's Jake Barber. He's essentially offering to do that in the civilian sphere. He's claiming to be able to, know how to summon, if you will, or detect or get these objects in the vicinity, and aims to potentially try to capture one himself outside of government reach. I don't know what to make of all that right now. I don't have any inside information. I've spoken with him, and for a time being, he was actually looking for me to put a team together to help analyze some of their radar data through some folks I have access to. But ultimately, I haven't seen any hard data from them, and waiting to see. They've made some pretty bold proclamations about what they can do and the time frames they can do it. So I'm waiting to see, along with everyone else, and whether he's successful or not, or whether the government decides to disclose certain aspects of it related to potential work they've already been doing on this is unknown.
Hey, thanks for being here. So just out of curiosity, you mentioned in the years after your own experiences, going back to military bases and speaking to personnel who described continuing to experience the stuff that your squadron did with similar, the spheres within, or the cubes within spheres and things like that. And I'm curious, to the extent that you've begun amassing your own reports, have you found reports of similar experiences or phenomena that predate your squadron's experience? How far back does that go? And to what extent does that overlap with the reports that you're getting from commercial pilots? I'm curious about the commercial versus military reports and how those similar differ.
Well, I will say someone sent me a newspaper clipping describing a cube in a sphere from the 50s or so that was spotted by a pilot, so that was kind of cool. I certainly at the time heard of other people seeing similar shapes, when I was in the squadron. There was really three primary shapes we were seeing at that time. It was a cube in the sphere, it was a metallic sphere, and also an elongated sphere, kind of tic-tac shape, but not as big as the one that Fravor described. The cube in a sphere was more sporadic to have that description kind of within the military community over the past 8 years, but the elongated spheres are more common. Military folks have more opportunity to visually ID objects that might not be self-illuminated or reflective, things of that nature. Commercial airlines don't have that luxury. You can't fly over and check things out. You don't have fancy radar systems. So the reports that commercial pilots report kind of fall in two categories. One are very high altitude, single kind of point sources of light that seem to be behaving in very strange ways, maneuvering very aggressively, almost like they're dogfighting, but they appear to be in, low Earth orbit or space. Not a lot we can do with those with current systems. As far as satellite tracking, we can discount, Starlink and other satellite flares, but there's not a whole lot more we can do to interpret those. The second category, however, are experiences that occur within the atmosphere, and often in very close proximity to the aircraft, right? Because it has to, because otherwise they can't really see it. And those sightings, range from anything to spheres of lights that are different colors, operating in groups of 3 that will just kind of go on one side of the plane to the other side of the plane for 2 hours as it transits at 550 knots, and then descends to the ocean or climbs into the sky as they approach the airport. The catalog includes, 180-degree out, 500-foot passes with 737s and a 200-yard sided black triangle. We have, multiple Tic Tacs objects, sized to Fravors sized objects. Some seen on approach corridors near airports. Others seen at altitude. Discs, of course. Very large black rectangles, if you will, look almost, 2-dimensional. Your classic saucer shape, all sorts, stuff that's, harder to describe. There's kind of a category that look like a barbell, like a T with an extra head. I have some very high resolution photos of those. I've been seen across the world. Kind of more nondescript shapes that I can't really describe, right? More geodesic kind of shapes. So there's quite a spectrum. It's pretty interesting. I am writing a book right now. I'm gonna have some of these stories in there. But there's hundreds of them, and once you see all these and you read these and you understand the person that's coming from, it's very hard to ignore.
So are a lot of these high resolution photos and videos? There's like the gimbal and go fast videos, for example. Are there like other videos that are being passed around that are like not yet public?
Yeah. So one of the, I think, biggest quiet successes of the past 5 to 8 years or so has been that a lot of UAP data that was either collected on the black side, like the deeply classified side, or were simply thrown away or ignored, was basically where all the data was. But what's happened over the past 5 to 8 years is that now that there's been attention on the topic and people understand the significance of it, people aren't ignoring it, they're saving it. And they're saving it within the confines of the normal secret and top secret systems, right, within the government. So something that didn't exist at all, except for, very covert ways, is now existing on top secret servers and secret servers where, there's, I think, 300,000 people in the U.S. with security clearance, right? So there's, thousands of people that now are seeing this data collection and imagery that is existing on the secret side that we still don't have access to here, but these people see this stuff and they don't know, some of the stuff's pretty remarkable, and when you see something like that, it's very hard to just walk away. So a lot of these people, they get out and they want to contribute and help and share about what they saw, and we've worked with some of these people and helped get their data sets, which we haven't seen because they're still classified, non-classified systems. We've helped get that data to the right sources in the government so that they can incorporate that into their understanding of the situation. So yeah, that it's a very big success is to have that now. And it's growing. There's thousands of photos and videos, on these systems.
Is there any possibility that they would get released, or is that a big crime?
So traditionally the topic has been that it's not the object that they're detecting that's classified, it's the system itself. The FLIR that was released is like commonly declassified. It's a relatively old system. It's not very secret or capable. And we literally make cruise videos that we share on YouTube, when we come back from deployment of FLIR footage. So it doesn't surprise me they didn't release that, but, radar data, more high quality imagery from, drones or satellites, they're never going to release that. They have the perfect justification for not. On top of that, however, if something enters AARO's hands, they now have a security classification guideline, which is the key document that determines what information is classified and not. they have a security classification guideline that classifies the reports that they receive. So for the first time ever, a UAP report is classified because of the content of it containing a UAP. And by policy, they classify any data that they receive that indicates the potential even for capabilities beyond the state of the art at a SAP level.
Right. AARO being the all-domain anomaly resolution office set up by Congress to investigate UFOs, UAP. So with the new leadership of AARO, do you see any differences in their openness and willingness to collaborate and just like the usefulness of the organization writ large?
Yeah, the older leadership did not demonstrate a lot of good faith in engaging people and in this topic. However, there is new leadership now, as per a rotation schedule. It wasn't anything nefarious. And this new guy comes highly recommended. People have vetted for him that I know and respect. And he has demonstrated, it seems, a willingness to be more open. At the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, at our UAP committee, AARO has actually started sending representatives to some of our meetings to look for ways where we can collaborate on engineering and scientific projects together. So, that's very positive. I've spoken to their new leadership as well, and, it appeared to me that he was willing and ready to engage with outside groups in order to help them solve their problems. But, ultimately the director of AARO has to answer to their board of advisors. They're called board of advisors, probably better to think of them more like a board of directors, but ultimately that's, who the director has to answer to, and, there's, I think, some controversy about how that has been constructed, and they only, John Klosky, the new director, is only going to have so much leeway in what he can do institutionally. So my opinion would be, and this is something I've thought a lot about in a formal way, is to, reorganize the UAP effort from a national perspective and take the role that AARO has been playing as a whole of government organization and relegating their role to a belly button between the intelligence community and DoD for a much broader national effort that would be housed outside of the DoD, because the DoD is essentially investigating illegal activities within the DoD, right? So there, it's common sense that incentive structure is not, good governance, right? So we need to remove AARO as having the lead on this and put it at a very high level within government, perhaps in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And then bring in other agencies that would be coordinated under that umbrella. DoD just doesn't also have the proper authorizations to interface with the various civilian organizations in a way that's consistent with our government.
I guess my question is, can you talk a little bit about what the FBI is working to investigate, and not to put you in like a tough position, but like, this is news to me. What would they be investigating when it came to a shadow program? Would it extend into anything the government would have been doing wrong, or would it be strictly like civilian investigations? And how big of an interest is this?
Specifically for them?
Yeah, for the FBI.
No, that's a good question. So the effort started bottoms up, where essentially interested agents started looking into this and eventually make contact with us and others. And, after kind of weighing the pros and cons, we, decided to engage with them and to, with the permission of the pilot to witness, introduce them so they could start building an understanding of, the issue and the severity and the commonplaceness of it. And, it started with a team of about 5 guys, and through some of our reports helped play a role, because they then could take that information, that report, and show it to other agents. They had sketch artists involved, they still do, so they can depict what they're seeing. And it really helped build a lot of support for this investigation from a bottoms-up level. And now it's essentially, there is support in the headquarters level. There's essentially a UAP national program manager who oversees coordination between these different field offices across the United States, and I work with them as well. And it's not like a well-resourced operation or highly prioritized, right? And that's something I want to change in the future. But it's very clear from the data that we've shared with them that they've collected independently that this is like a very clear national security risk. And when the New Jersey incidents started kicking off, they were actually tapped to help lead the efforts into investigating it based off of their previous work. But their legal justification for investing it, they're under the Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate. And essentially the general rationale is that if there are things that are operating within the continental United States, it's reasonable to assume that there could be a ground station or something else that's being operated to control these, which would fall under their law enforcement jurisdiction.
So tell me, this is a national security risk for us. Who should we be mad at that this isn't being taken more seriously? Like, it seems like you guys have been reporting this for a long time. You guys pilots are reporting this. These things are flying out there regardless of who made them or where they come from. It seems like we should be very worried that, if nothing else, we're on a commercial plane, we could whack into one of these ourselves. So who should we be upset with then? Is it someone in the military that's just not taking it seriously? Is it our politicians? Seems like a safety issue.
I think the ultimate answer to that question is going to reside about what the government has known about this and for how long they've known about that. Because if they have been explicitly hiding the existence of objects that are regularly operating in our airspace without informing the aviation or scientific community, there's massive liability there, an issue, and that's who I would be mad at. Now, if we step back from that assumption, however, and we kind of look at it perhaps from a more earthbound perspective and isolated, such as with the New Jersey incident, we say, I don't know if these are China operating, whether DJI drones have executed a program from China to all fly at the same time, something wacky, right? So if we just look at it from that type of perspective, it's like, all right, very clearly we are not prepared from a legislative, a policy, and an operational perspective to deal with some of the cutting-edge warfare that we've been seeing in Eastern Europe. We're clearly not able to contend with that here, especially when we're spending however many trillions of dollars on our defense budget. I think kind of strategic planning has led us into this hole where we're now vulnerable to this threat that has been staring us in the face for a number of years, because we're building these systems ourselves. We're building autonomous fighter jets now. I helped do it as some of the work I worked on. So we've known this is where things are trending. We just ignored the threat, even though people like myself and others have been trying to sound an alarm that this is a pending disaster, right? Because 10 years from now, how many drones do you think are going to be in the air, right? And if we don't have like an extremely keen understanding and tracking capability of where those objects are for avoidance, for security purposes, and everything else, we're going to lose control of our airspace.
So you think we're already behind?
New Jersey demonstrated that, at least from a policy perspective. We have the technology to implement to solve those solutions, but they're owned by the DoD to employ in a foreign country. Take DoD technology and put it, at Walmart to detect drones. Again, they don't have the authorities to do that. Yeah. So it's this kind of intermixing of policy. We're not used to threats on the homeland in that manner.
Yeah. Scary.
Yeah.
Are you scared, or should we be scared?
I'm scared that a foreign nation is going to utilize the uncertainty to do something nefarious. I'm afraid that potentially adversaries are going to use our hesitancy to engage on this fully with our innovation ecosystem and with the full might of our country to potentially exceed our understanding of the solution, and perhaps in a way that greatly benefits that country. Those are the things that concern me.
Hey, so I was going to ask, so these things seem like they're like monuments to our shortfalls or our blind spots, but you also sound like it's just like a bureaucratic failing or like an issue with data flows or information flows, like maybe the government already knows about them?
So, I mean, that's certainly part of I think the average government has gaps in its ability to respond, such as in the incident in New Jersey, right? So local law enforcement, state police, the FBI, Homeland Security, maybe the DOD, right? Because, like, hey, you have all these sensor systems. Why can't you tell us where these objects are, right? But they're not used to coordinating in that fashion for those types of threats, right? Like small unmanned systems over land, right? So our systems aren't super designed for that. So all of those things are showing us that we're not ready to deal with that type of warfare, that type of threat. If you zoom way out and you look at this kind of like potential 70 or 80 year history of this topic and what has been understood, then, you know, like I said, I've kind of butted up into certain aspects of where it seems the government has been looking at this for quite some time. And in that area, you know, it's about trying to get in that data stream, right? I find it highly unlikely they would share that information with us, even if it is strictly because of the classification systems or the classification of the systems that they're recording it with. So I don't think it's an overly cumbersome technical challenge necessarily. From a technical detection standpoint, you don't need some super exotic sensor necessarily. You need to have, you know, a proper multimodal detection capability with data fusion, right? Which sounds pretty fancy, but, you know, it's pretty standard for, you know, sensor systems nowadays. You just need to have that in the right place at the right time, right? So by having a larger data set of the occurrences, especially if they're public, then we can build an understanding and perhaps model of where we need to look, how we need to look to be able to get those sensors on. So there are some technical challenges, but none of them are like massive. So it's more about like having enough data to really be able to use those systems.
Okay, so it's not like these aren't like betraying some kind of like unknown kind of like laws of physics or anything. Because you're talking about the beams of light going around the cockpit. Like kinda,
yeah, I mean there's stuff that we don't necessarily understand how it's operating, right? And if we have a good sense, you know, the proper sensor modalities looking at it, then we might be able to learn something about the propulsion systems. If we have the right radar looking at it, we might be able to determine different signatures that they exhibit, which can inform, you know, future development or work on different radar systems, or perhaps even modifying existing systems to look for those particular signals in a way that don't exist. So I think there's a ton of fruit on the tree when it comes to technical solutions.
Will that have to be done? That has to be something that like needs to be prioritized.
It is, and whether I'm comfortable saying I assume that the government, at least perhaps very secretive portions of the government, are doing that. But there's nothing that stops us legally from just figuring it out on our own, right? And that's some of the work that we're doing at the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics that I chair. That's, you know, research I've been doing with the soft data I've been getting from witnesses to understand those trends and those, you know, potential things that might help us design sensors in the future. So yeah, there's certainly a lot there. And if that's something you're interested in, you know, our group is open to anyone, you know, with a technical background that wants to try to contribute. There's a number of detection projects going on, and we have opportunities to get access to some very unique data sets.
So also just one last question. So if you had like a golden wish list, just like what would it consist of? Like what would Congress be approving of entirely, and like what would expedite this process to its fruition?
Yeah, so I have a path for that. I have several paths for that. But one particular path is from a technical solutions standpoint. There's, you know, a lot of sensors within the atmosphere that exist. There's a lot of sensors in space that look down into the atmosphere. You can't see everything, of course, between the sensor and the target or Earth, but, you know, within the focal plane, you know, typically exists within the atmosphere, so you can pick out planes and things of that nature, or things on the ground. So it's not a good place to really invest in new capabilities that are associated with the UAP topic. And before I get into that, let me just say, you know, I've thought a lot about how to engage on this topic in a fruitful way. And, you know, one thing we've touched on today is how there's no resources within the federal government to apply to this. But there is a model, I think, that is successful in this area, which is, I call it like a tri-use model. So similar to a dual-use model that businesses use where they sell to commercial customers and defense customers or military customers have those two revenue streams, two customer bases. I would argue there's a model where there's tri-use, right, where you're providing a capability that has a normal commercial use case, a normal defense use case, but might also be applicable for better understanding UAP. So as I've been looking at ways to apply that model, one particular area that I'm aware has a deficit in sensing systems, but is key to understanding and perhaps learning what that next level of answer is about where these things come from, is building essentially a distributed sensor network in space. Right now, we track objects in orbit, debris, and adversarial systems through an array of radar systems across the globe that the Space Force operates. About $40 billion worth of facility, highly expensive, inefficient, and limited accuracy, high latency. So we're proposing utilizing a network of sensors that are distributed in orbit to provide real-time situational awareness of debris. Adversarial systems provide a sensing system for autonomous applications in space, as well as detect and evaluate objects that perhaps aren't being tracked right now. That would also provide us a key capability to potentially maintain custody of these objects if they leave or enter the atmosphere. So that would be my wish list to get that project fully funded and operational. So we're actively fundraising to get that stood up.
What's the number?
What's the number on that?
What?
On the how much money in the fundraising?
We're raising $5 million. Yeah. Say the first part. $5 million for 2 years to get us to two initial products that allow us to start building that solution, right? So we have a stair-step process where first we have novel neural networks that we've developed in order to do this. And so the process, kind of go-to-market strategy, is to be able to utilize these algorithms, our own sensor package that we're selling to customers to provide them onboard situational awareness. We'll preserve that data, and it will basically build a network through our customer's platform that will then supplement with multimodal platforms that we'll launch and own ourselves to fill the gaps.
I don't know if this is like a silly question or not, but I mean, out of all these accounts that you've and the people that encountered this, none has attacked or attempted to, or you've never heard of anything like that?
There's some historical cases, I think one in the 70s and one in the 90s over Iran, where both times they encountered something, multiple fighter jets responded to it, and on both occasions the pilots attempted to fire on the object. One of the times, I believe the aircraft had a total electrical failure as soon as they tried to employ on the object. And I think the second time there was some kind of issue, but they lost one of their aircraft. Yeah. And I'm not super smart on those cases, but if you search the Iran cases, they'll pop up.
That's crazy.
Yeah, I believe that one was the one in the 70s.
Yeah, I thought there was two, and I thought they were a decade or two apart. But right over Tehran, both of them, I believe. I get some interesting reports from Israel as well. Some of their IDF forces and whatnot. They see some pretty cool stuff too.
Sorry, I don't know if this question has been asked already, but I did walk in and you were talking about funding. So my question is about any like exciting projects that are happening that you particularly think should be on our radar. And the question that several folks have been asking, right, is what is the speculation? Like what is of interest for private venture capital, right? We understand more or less what is of interest to the nation, but in terms of what is possible, not just like nefarious, but other things that are awesome and should be happening that you more or less could generously maybe share as to like what might be there possible.
Yeah, great question. So I'll start with the first one. Right now on my radar, outside of the for-profit I just mentioned, Americans for Safe Aerospace, my nonprofit, the amount of like blocking and tackling that we do on the ground every day to kind of move this conversation forward can't really be understated. And we now are in a position with our reputation and brand and connections that we've been making to expand internationally. We have a group within Australia that's very interested in creating a sister organization. Same with a parliament member in Japan. I'm going to Dubai to speak at a UAP conference in a month and a half. And at my last nonprofit, we had the economic advisor from Saudi Arabia. And there's a number of other countries as well. So, this very much is a global phenomenon. I had a good conversation with the economic advisor about sightings they've been having. But we're really excited and fundraising actively now within the nonprofit to be able to formalize a reporting system and expand it internationally and be able to license that reporting system out to these individual companies, which will allow us to get a global look at the type of data we've been receiving in the United States, which can then arm those individual countries to have the same policies and reforms that we've had here within the country. On the technical and the VC side, I see great opportunity on the VC side, so much so that I spent a year trying to stand one up. I was unsuccessful in raising the funds, but would have been my first fund. But that tri-use model that I just described about, looking for technology that has those military as well as commercial use cases that might be relevant for the UAP topic extend beyond just sensing. It goes into advanced material science and metamaterials. It goes into exotic propulsion. It goes into communication systems, novel energy generation. And that work is going on. And interestingly enough, some of the people that are doing this work have, claimed that they have worked on reverse engineering programs for the government. And, these are DARPA-funded efforts, Air Force research labs, and the like. And these particular cases I'm talking about often were funded by the National Science Foundation as well. And I've spent the past 8 months or so working with leadership at the National Science Foundation. And this recently culminated about a month ago, but the director of their technology innovation program is ready to publicly establish a UAP program office at the National Science Foundation. And I'm currently brokering a meeting with him and representatives within Congress to continue to work on that. And that, that is a key piece, I think, that is going to energize this innovation ecosystem to be able to actually, in the manner that we do with every other company and technology, in this country, start utilizing, natural resources and grant funding to be able to move this conversation forward. And again, it's not just sensing. The portfolio that we're talking about constructing goes into advanced material science and others that a lot of people would consider to be very adjacent, if not directly related to UAP. And again, that director has offered to brief Congress on technologies they've already invested in that would be part of this new portfolio. So we're seeing a lot of energy within kind of the startup ecosystem. We're starting to see it within some of those funding mechanisms. I've also worked with the Small Business Administration, who essentially controls the budget for the Office of Strategic Capital. That is another thing I've been considering as far as a strategic play to be able to empower the VC community in order to take on the risk that comes with something with what many might consider a slightly less defined market. But if you combine it with those traditional commercial and military markets, I think there's a very viable and predictable market there, especially in space, which is why I targeted it.
Any closing questions?
So I want to talk a little bit about like the crash retrieval legacy programs that Rush has kind of been speaking about. It's something I've, as a kid been obsessed with. And I'm just wondering if that might be the reason why a lot of this information can't come out, if crashes have happened and retrievals have happened since as early as potentially the one in Italy in 33 and, Roswell, as everyone knows. I'm just wondering if it's kind of protected by these private aerospace companies that Jake Barber, work for retrieving for, where they're not essentially like Freedom of Information Act doesn't work for them because it's so private and they're in potentially, underground facilities in California and whatnot, and we just have no access because it's private. So I was just wondering your comments on that.
Yeah, it's I've never been read into any programs on that, right? So it's just important for me to say, because my understanding and answer is based on what I've learned in the public sphere, as well as the interactions that I've had with people, which I think that latter category is the more impactful one, although harder to validate. But, I've bumped up against people that have, actively, bumped into the program, like various aspects of it, right? For example, I know someone that was very well respected within the Space Force who worked on object detection, I'll say, who bumped into this, had his security clearance stripped when he started raising red flags about this whole class of objects that, were getting filtered out, if you will. And, the same thing has happened in advanced material science tooling, such as electron scanning microscopes and, the very advanced versions of that. There's some, interesting government agencies that buy some very cutting edge capabilities there. DARPA and propulsion, as well as NASA, they've been doing some interesting stuff there as well. So it's clear to me that there is infrastructure and that there is, people that seem to crop out of it from time to time and start working privately on interesting technology. And those are areas that I've been keeping my eye on. But I can't really say for any certainty about the extent. Of course, the details that Grusha went into are beyond the scope of my experience.
What's the best way to keep up with your work and developments as things are unfolding?
I would say the best way, I'd highly encourage you to go to safeaerospace.org and sign up for my website. We're not going to email you, though, so it's not a good way to stay up to date, but it is going to show representatives in DC that people are interested in this. But otherwise, follow me on X, Uncertain Vector. That's kind of where I'm going to spout off most information directly. Uncertain Vector, if I didn't say it. I don't know if I said it.
Just like in your opinion, whether it's adversary or non-adversary, what do you think the goal of these objects are? Like, what do you think they're doing?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. I think a common thing you hear is they're, prepping the battlefield in some case. I don't want to alarm anyone or make anyone think I think these are hostile. I don't really get that intent, but to just constantly hover over near military activity and bases, and civilian population centers, that's what we would do. So ultimately, I don't think we have enough information to really say, but that's one logical conclusion you'll probably hear out there. But, I would understand that that's based off of very limited information.
So on a personal and professional level, like delving into this topic, have you faced any backlash or any positive admiration? And how has that changed over the years?
Yeah, it's a complicated topic. I feel privileged to be in the position I am to have this conversation. So many people come up to me and share personal experiences that they've often never shared or only shared with their spouse, right? So what a cool position to be in. I don't really care about the stigma. If I did, I probably wouldn't have gone down this road as far as I have. But I'm confident in my experiences and my professional background as a pilot. And I know no one that disbelieves me can discount all of that, right? So I'm just confident in my experiences and experiences of my colleagues, and I find, maybe it's selection bias, but most people who perhaps turn their nose up at this topic don't often directly engage with me. So perhaps I just don't get that feedback. But the feedback I do get from people that reach out has, been incredibly supportive. Very little, outside the box strangeness that one might expect in this topic, right? I think everyone has a fear that it's a repository for mental illness or something, silly like that. But, well, there's the occasional, crazy email. It's been very light considering the tens of thousands of emails I've received over the past 8 years. So No, it's you know, it hasn't been an easy path or journey, but it's, you know, I think it's a privilege to be able to be part of this conversation.
Any final questions? Cool. So let's thank Ryan Graves for this wonderful. So we also have a couple more events that may be of interest to people. So Ryan's organization, AIAA UAP, we have 2 more events with their technical leads, Rex Grove talking about hardware factors and Dr. Sean Perchnicki talking about human factors. So those will be like Zoom-style events over the next couple weeks. So they're also going to be in the engineering building. You can follow our events page to find out more. And also, in 1 month from today, we have another keynote speaker that'll be in person. That'll be former director NOAA director and Rear Admiral Tim Gallaudet. So he'll be coming to speak on campus, and some people asked about underwater transmedium UFOs, so he's going to talk more about that. He was in the Navy as well.
He's also an advisor at my nonprofit.
Oh, and also an advisor at Ryan's nonprofit. Okay, so I guess this is all connected. So, cool. Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was awesome.